Shalom.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh, it's going good. How are you doing?
Oh, thank God. So how do you pronounce your last name? Is it Ribic?
It's Rebic. A lot of people call it Ribic. When I was in the Army, a lot of people were mistaken as Rybic, and I'm like, it's Rebic. It's pronounced as it's spelled. It's Rebic. That's why I like to Hebraicize it and change it to Vav, because Rebic is Czech-Russian, and it means spike. Yeah, spike is a beautiful symbol of Vav in the Aleph Bet, so I'd like to get it changed to Vav one day. I figured I'd save that for when I make Aliyah.
Right. Because the Vav is the shape of a spike. I get it. Cool.
Exactly.
So, what do you consider yourself now, religiously?
I would probably have to say I consider myself probably unaffiliated, really, or independent. You know, I've had a really, I call it an adventure. It's really been more of a quest to really find out just what kind of Jew I would think I am. And there's been times when I thought, you know, what would other people consider me as and stuff. But then I realized that ultimately it's a how would you consider yourself kind of question, I guess is how I would say it. I don't know. I'd like to consider myself like conservative or conservadox even, based on certain thoughts.
Were you born Jewish or you converted?
I was born Jewish. My biological father is Sephardic and my mother is Ashkenazi.
Cool. So how do you decide on the conservadox or conservative versus traditional orthodoxy?
Basically, orthodoxy, it's a great, I mean, you know, I don't put anybody down for what they believe or anything like that. I'd have to say it just seemed that orthodoxy is very diverse. You got your Hasidim and your Haredim and you have the Litvish and you have your modern Orthodox and then you got your fringe groups like the Open Orthodox and then you have people who just say Orthodox. You know, I could go straight Orthodox, but then what would I be? People got to further break these things down and stuff. And see, that's where I feel is probably the issue.
The main issue between conservative and Orthodox, I think, really occurred, I believe, in 1956, when they said it was okay for people to drive on Shabbat if there was no way for them to get to the synagogue. That's when the real rift started. JTS actually started off as a modern Orthodox yeshiva. And till the mid-50s, did the conservative movement actually break away from modern orthodoxy of that time? Now, look, nowadays you hear many people attack conservative for being out there or outside of the pale of observance. Now, what many don't know is that initially this was not the case. Actually, initially, the most, if not all, conservative synagogues actually had separated seating for men and women. And honestly, the only difference between a conservative synagogue and a mainstream Orthodox one was that the rabbi's sermon was in English instead of Yiddish. And like I said, till the main riff in the mid-50s, when their ruling body allowed congregants to drive to synagogue on Shabbat instead of just staying home, that's really what made the big separation. Now, since then, the conservative movement has become engulfed by reform and less religious outfits that has JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, ordaining women, removing mechitzot, counting women in minyanim, and taking a more egalitarian approach to everything truly conservative. To the point that today, the only truly conservative Jew is the conservative rabbi, mainly because most Jews who attend conservative synagogues are more reformed than anything else. Now, I consider myself a student and teacher of halakha, and from a halachic perspective, some things within the conservative movement bothers me more than other things. For example, the mechitza, most people don't know that at least the actual wall of separation is just a minhag. It's not an actual halacha. Actually, also the counting of women in minyanim, although when I had my own show I didn't do, honestly, is really just a minhag, because before the Shulchan Aruch, it really appears nowhere that there's some sort of prohibition that you can't count women in a minyan. Now, it's probably because women almost never went to shul or almost never left the home. Also, pants is really not a halachic issue for me. And, or women rabbis. I mean, I made a whole video on why I'm against the notion of women becoming rabbis, but it's not against halakha, right? And I'm still against it. In other words, we have to view things with halachic lenses. So the only real issue, in my opinion, is the driving on Shabbat. Right? How do you feel about people who are driving on Shabbos?
Well, honestly, I feel if you don't live far enough, I feel if you don't live close enough to shul that you should get there before sundown. For instance, I live in Oklahoma, and the majority of synagogues are in Tulsa and Oklahoma City. And if you're living like in Pryor, basically, if you live like an hour or two away from Tulsa, and it's right before Shabbat, you should really get there. I mean, you should really drive there before the sun goes down. Otherwise, I don't believe anybody should drive on Shabbat. You should do any kind of physical work activity on Shabbat.
I don't see such a big difference between conservative and Orthodox, with the exception of the driving. I mean, conservative Judaism still emphasizes kashrut. But how'd you get smicha? Do you have smicha, or are you just a teacher?
I have smicha. I received it from a rabbi in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, named Rabbi Ron Grossman, and he received smicha from another rabbi in Minnesota named Yochanan Balak, who is Orthodox. Rabbi Grossman is a Reconstructionist, or he affiliates Reconstructionism. To be honest with you, I don't really affiliate. You know, I practice Judaism. I teach people. I'm happy to perform weddings, life cycle events, and I'm happy to be there and provide counsel and help for people. But as far as maintaining a congregation or a synagogue, I don't do that, because it seems there's always going to be someone who wants to fight you. There's always going to be someone who wants to say, you're not doing it right, don't do it this way. And that's one of the things I feel is a hindrance in Judaism. I mean, I'm a firm believer that, you got to question everything. But when you question everything with an aggressive overtone and try to pick a fight with something, you're not really trying to question it in an idea to learn. You're trying to question it as a way of saying, you're not doing it right, I'm doing it right. The way you're doing it is a falsity. It's heresy. It's heretical. And that I've met so many people that are just angry that way. And the majority of them all seem to come not from the Orthodoxy. The majority of people who seem to say that you're not doing it right with aggressive overtones tend to come from the Reform or the progressive or more liberal branches of Judaism.
Wait, you're saying that the Reform are typically more outspoken in terms of correcting others than Orthodox Jews are?
Towards me, I've received some serious hatred.
I also feel it's not only the Orthodox. I mean, I feel for sure the Reform and the more liberal groups are a little more outspoken, at least just because there are more of them. But to really know what an Orthodox Jew thinks, you have to live in an Orthodox community. And most people don't know Orthodox Jews. It's why when I see people online romanticizing Jews and putting pictures up of Hasidim on their wall, they didn't even know who these people are. And these are people who've never met Orthodox Jews, who don't live in Orthodox neighborhoods and don't know that the average Orthodox Jew would not be very kind to them, especially if they don't think like they do. But I think in terms of radicalization, that's seen more what people would call progressive Judaism, just because they're not really arguing for the sake of God. I don't think a Reformed Jew walks around thinking that theologically he's in the right. I mean, he feels that the Orthodox, mind you, it's a Reform movement that gave Jews his title Orthodox to make them seem backwards and not progressive. They'll tell the Orthodox Jew, what, you really believe this? That's for the Bronze Age. That's not for today, this and that, use common sense. In other words, they know that the Orthodox Jew is more of a fundamentalist, takes the Bible literally, and tries to even apply the words and stories of Chazal to his everyday life. It's really an outspokenness from a different perspective. This is something I don't think that we see in other religions, right? I don't think there are many Christians who walk around saying that they know that they don't have Jesus' authentic message, but in some way, the religious fundamentalists should in some way be happy with less. Now, this is something that we see in the conservative and Reform movement, more in the Reform movement, because they know they do things in spite of what the Torah tells them not to do, like endorse homosexual relations, ordain gay clergy, eat shrimp. There's a famous story about the first graduating class of Hebrew Union College, right, where they serve shrimp and oysters and all this stuff.
Oh, I read about that, yeah. I don't know. When it comes to not keeping kosher, that seems to be a big problem I have with a lot of the more liberal groups, a lot of the more Reform groups. It seems to be kind of like a how-to guide on how to make Judaism work for you, how to make it work, fit your lifestyle, your life. The rules aren't binding. You can find ways around them and stuff. I personally think you don't make Judaism work for you. You work for Judaism, basically. You have to keep the rules. You have to keep the commandments. You have to keep the mitzvah. You can't just walk around and, not think that there's some divine, intervention in the world. How knowledgeable are you on the humanistic movement? Do you know anything? Have you studied anything about that?
The Reform movement is really part of the humanistic movement.
Exactly.
They believe their ethics.
The founder of the humanistic movement was a Reform rabbi named Sherman Wine. I've talked to some Society of Humanistic Judaism people, and they said that they wouldn't wear yarmulkes because that could make them considered religious. I said, well, wearing a yarmulke, and I feel that's a sign of not just, religion, that's a sign of being a Jew. And they said, we don't try to push out that we're Jewish because we're no different than anybody else in the world. And I was thinking, well, then why add Judaism to the title? Why don't you just be Society of Humanism? Why turn Judaism into a humanistic movement? Why take God out of it? Why take God out of Judaism? I don't understand how
because ultimately their movement is ethnocentric in nature. In other words, they would probably insist that their children would marry Jewish, even though they don't necessarily believe in God. If someone calls himself a humanist, he means that he doesn't get his values from the Bible. He learns from humanity. He believes that humanity is in some sort of quest to perfect itself. And we see how great that turned out in places like the Soviet Union. When they toss out the Bible, they just leave a trail of carnage. What many of these humanists fail to understand is that the only reason they could even claim to be ethical nowadays is because they have a path that is already laid for them by their ancestors. In other words, they're standing on the shoulders of giants. All of them have an ancestor, a grandmother, a grandfather who was religious and imparted these religious biblical values to them. So now it's easy for them to claim to be ethical off the backs of their religious parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. But eventually their philosophy will end up catching up with them, and this is what we see with the Soviet Union in places that toss out the Bible completely. You don't live life in a very happy manner, walking around thinking that you're just a piece of cosmic junk, that everything happened by mistake. But many of their kids don't remain Jewish because they actually come to the conclusion that without God, without Torah, what's the point? So they just end up marrying off. Honestly, I don't think survival in itself is a virtue, but I think the purpose of becoming or remaining Jewish is to impart biblical values to the world and to ultimately usher in periods of peace. That's my approach to the whole issue.